It's the week ending Saturday, the 3rd of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump stun Washington by appearing to back gun control laws, Deputy PM Barnaby Joyce resign from the Australian government, and the beast from the east, snow, causing havoc across Europe. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie and Arion McNicoll, and from the week junior, Felicity Capon. Starting the show this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we discovered that Ivanka Trump has daddy issues in that her daddy has issues.
I think it's a pretty inappropriate question to ask a daughter if she believes the accusers of her father when he's affirmatively stated that there's no truth to it. I don't think that's a question you would ask many other daughters. I believe my father. I know my father. So I think I have that right as a daughter to believe my father.
Ivanka Trump there, responding to a question about the sexual harassment allegations against her father, speaking on NBC's Today programme this week. Now, Arion, that exchange has been quite widely reported, so why is it your underreported story of the week then? Why is it on our radar?
Well, so this was part of a pretty controversial tour of duty that Ivanka Trump took, probably one of her most high-profile foreign trips that she's taken since she went to the G20 last year.
So where was she when she gave this interview?
She was in Sochi. She was representing the US, wearing typically two hats as both advisor to the president and also a kind of general ambassador. Hell, she was sort of wearing three hats because simultaneously she was also being the daughter to her dad. And it was in that way perhaps controversial that she was answering a question that was about something that her father had potentially done wrong. And she chose to interpret it as a thing that was about her relationship as her father's daughter, rather than as an official employed by the government.
I mean, her answer was, you wouldn't ask that of many other daughters. But, I mean, for a start, you could argue you wouldn't have to ask that of many other daughters. But secondly, she's not any other daughter. She is the daughter of the President of the United States, and she has an official position. What's the debate here? Whether she should be involved or something more about the allegations against Donald Trump?
Well, I think there's several things that are interesting here. First of all, it really underlines the absurdity of her nepotistic appointment to this very senior role within the Trump administration. But also, she can't just dodge out of this question pretending that it doesn't matter, because it does matter. And the most recent allegations that we've had of sexual inappropriateness on behalf of Donald Trump, actually, it turns out, in both the case of Stormy Daniels, who was a porn star, and the Playboy model Karen McDougal, at least appear to have been consensual relationships. But what's significant about them is that they were both cases where the two women's silence was bought, and bought at a crucial moment, specifically just before the election.
Okay,
and
let's talk about their silence being bought, if that's what happened, in just a second. Let's park that issue and return to it. On the issue of whether Ivanka Trump should be asked questions about her father's sexual infidelity, does that make you comfortable or uncomfortable, Felicity?
It makes me extremely uncomfortable. And actually, I see that it's problematic that she's not just a daughter, she's a senior presidential advisor. She has her father's ear on all sorts of things. I see the problems with that. I really bristle at the idea that all of Trump's female family members are somehow tainted with whatever the hell Trump is supposed to have done. I think you see it with Ivanka. I think you see it with Melania. They can't seem to do anything without having to answer for his behaviour. And I just don't think that's right. I mean, whatever you think about Ivanka, I don't think she's that fantastically brilliant, but she shouldn't have to defend him. And it was a stupid question. I think she handled it very well. What answer was the reporter expecting to get back, firstly? And secondly, I think these women, Melania and Ivanka, should just be women in their own right. You know, she's done a great job in the Winter Olympics. Melania, if she wants to start an anti-bullying initiative, she shouldn't have to be trolled mercilessly with people saying, well, why don't you, make the president less of a bully?
Okay, but you are a journalist. If you had an interview with Ivanka Trump, Would you not ask her this question?
I mean, yeah, it's generated a ton of headlines. We're talking about it, so it's a lot of publicity. But he was never going to get a response, and he knew that. And I think she handled it with a lot of decorum. And I think it also raises questions about, family. Do you defend your family to the bitter end, no matter what they're accused of? Which is interesting, and she clearly will defend her father. I think a lot of daughters would.
But
Rebecca.
It was a tactical choice for her to respond to that question as a daughter, because it was just a kind of an appeal to emotion. How it's very hurtful for me to hear you repeat these things about my father, rather than, I think she could have addressed it more professionally, because if you asked that question about your boss, you wouldn't say, it really upsets me that you would think my boss would do that. You just reply with this kind of blank, he hasn't done anything wrong, there have been no charges, blah, 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 blah. But she chose instead to take on that role of the upset daughter. Although I do agree that all the women, in Trump's circle have come under a lot of fire and pressure to explain away his behaviour. The thing with the question about whether people should be punished for standing by their family members as well, I think is a really interesting one, with all the Woody Allen allegations. It's crazy because he doesn't have a social media presence, so he hasn't had that online backlash. He doesn't really have a huge public profile in that way. So instead you've had people trolling Diane Keaton mercilessly for saying that she would stand by him and that she didn't believe the allegations. I don't know if that's right. Are there any other crimes where we pick on people connected to the alleged criminal and ask them if they think that the allegations are true?
But there's a distinct difference here, which is there is one allegation against Woody Allen, and it's a very serious one, and there are multiple against Donald Trump, and he's the president.
I think that's right, and I think that it's the weight of evidence. While, yes, none of these accusations have yet gone to trial, it's the weight of evidence and the ongoing coalescing of similar facts and similar attributes to the stories of the different women that seem to provide weight to their individual stories. So I think that's what makes at least the accusations against Trump compelling. On the question of whether she shouldn't be asked those questions because she is Trump's daughter, I just think that really does underline the difficulty of the
employing
way that
your family?
Yeah,
I mean, she took the job, right?
Right, and she is a special advisor to one of the most powerful people in the world, and so surely in that capacity, anything's fair game.
But you do think, though, if she was Chelsea Clinton, in other words, if she was just first daughter and her father was accused of doing something, with his genitals, that's not something that she should have to answer. It's because she has an official position.
But I think that it's an important question and an important issue because it speaks to some of the things that Trump is trying to explicitly deny and say, for example, some of the more extreme aspects of the Steele dossier, which suggested that Trump had these cavorting sex sessions with Russian prostitutes in Russia. Suddenly the revelation that yet more women had similar types of liaisons with him does seem to suggest that maybe it's not so unlikely that those accusations could be true. So it comes straight back to stuff that matters.
Yeah, fine, but why go after Ivanka Trump? I just don't understand why you're directing all your energies on his daughter. What is that going to achieve?
I honestly think there's a really strong undercurrent of people who are anti-Trump, and they also deep down really want to kind of break Melania and Ivanka, and they want to push them into a corner and make them admit that Trump has actually done these things and that Trump is a terrible person. It's like all the allegations about not just the sexual misconduct, but all the stuff about the Trump tapes, the alleged consensual rendezvous with prostitutes. Part of the reason that people like to make such a big fuss of it, and people follow every move that Melania makes, every expression on her face is shared on Twitter. People want to force her to admit how terrible Trump is and how many times that he's cheated on her.
But there's a simultaneous, there's another group simultaneously who are trying to say these people are perfectly innocent and they have no responsibility in anything that he has done.
I don't think they do. Not in these allegations anyway. Allegations of sexual assault and worse. They're the victims. He's the bully. I think Melania and Ivanka, not to the same extent, but I just don't understand.
There's also this thing about, because I remember in the presidential debates where they were both asked that awkward question, what in your opponent do you think is actually a valuable skill? I can't now remember what Donald Trump said about Hillary Clinton, but anyway.
She was tough.
She was tough, there we go. But Hillary did say, didn't she, I respect him as a father. And actually that did seem like a genuine thing. Whatever you think about Trump's politics and his persona, actually his family do seem to love him. Yeah. He genuinely seems to be a family man.
It was classic shade, though, because she was asked, what do you like about your opponent? And her answer was somebody else.
Yeah, sure. But nonetheless, it's like the final thing that the anti-Trump brigade could level against Trump, they haven't quite managed to succeed in getting across yet. You know, you can discredit almost everything he says politically and everything he's done corporately, but actually his family do seem to love him, and he seems to be a reasonable family man, even if it seems he's been cheating on his wives.
Yeah, which sort of comes back to the question of should you be expected to publicly and slightly kind of communist China-y disown your family vocally in public because they've had these allegations levelled against them. There aren't many types of crime where we would ever expect to quiz the relatives or associates, even if she wasn't Trump's daughter, even if she was just a high-level employee, you wouldn't ordinarily go around asking people whether what they think about those allegations.
You would ask people to find out what their character's like, and it is powerful if someone extremely close to them comes out and says no.
Relatives will always, not always. Relatives will often believe their family members are innocent of crimes, even if they've actually been convicted of them. So, is there really anything useful to be drawn from challenging someone and then making a point about their response if they maintain that their relative is innocent? Because isn't that quite like a natural response?
I think it's a natural response, but I think if the question, I'm not sure if this is what the interviewer was driving at, but if the question that he was going for was, do you accept that Trump was involved in buying the silence of women at a crucial moment in the presidential election that led to him becoming president, and therefore that there's blackmail material out there on him that was bought and put away deliberately by publications that wanted to silence it, and therefore there could be other compromising material on the man that you work for and is your father?
This is a bloody long question for today's programme. This is why NBC journalists don't ask this question.
But I mean,
but if that's the question he was going for, what?
Well, then
it's legitimate.
It's legitimate.
Okay, let's talk about that because we parked it earlier. So what is the story? Just enlighten us, for those who haven't been following this in micro detail and actually read what Ronan Farrow writes. What is the allegation about hushed-up stories around this?
Yeah, so Karen McDougal, who's this playmate, she has recently revealed that she had a consensual relationship with Trump that took place about a year after he married Melania and his son had just been born. And she was ready to tell that story at the point where his presidential campaign was starting to sort of get up and running. And it was bought by the National Enquirer.
When you say was ready to tell, she was ready to sell. She sold it to them.
Yes, she did, actually. And she was even willing to sell it, maybe knowing that it was going to get killed. She's later had a bout of conscience and decided that she thinks the fact that the story went untold probably is a matter of some national importance, and so she's out telling the story now.
I mean, a lot of people just won't realise this happens. Have you been aware of this, Rebecca? The idea that a media company, so this was bought by the parent company of the National Enquirer, her story, according to Ronan Farrow, that a media company would buy someone's story seeming like they're going to publish a kiss and tell and then not publish.
Yeah, and the additional thing about in this case is that the CEO of the company, David Pecker, is a friend of Trump's. So you've opened up this scenario where he's this powerful media mogul, he's very chummy with the president, he can just buy up stories. Theoretically, he could just, he's got kind of an endless amount of money to do this. He could buy up any story. He could offer you twice as much as any other publisher, but that story will never actually be published. And so it does open up an interesting ethical dilemma about whether that should be allowed. If you buy a story and then you don't publish it after a certain amount of time, should there be some kind of clause where they can go and sell that story to someone else where it may actually get told? Because, you're looking at pretty serious stories about the president's character being, suppressed from the public. And I think there is a public interest in knowing even consensual affairs. People want to know what kind of man is in the Oval Office.
Felicity.
Yeah, sure. I think it raises another ethical dilemma of the whole innocent until proven guilty thing. I'm not a big defender of Trump at all. And I'm a huge supporter of the whole Me Too movement and this climate that we're seeing. But I do think
As is Ivanka Trump, according to Twitter.
But I do think that it's very, especially with social media, it's very easy to start accusing people left, right and centre. There's a lot of allegations going around. And I think that's another problematic thing with, asking Ivanka to defend him. It's like, why shouldn't she, when actually no one has proven any of these, salacious, scandalous stories?
But we haven't applied that standard to so many other things recently,
No, but we should.
Yeah.
So, Arion, do you think there is going to be a sea change now in terms of these media companies buying people's silence with stories about anyone powerful? Because it seems like in the social media age, you can't really.
I don't think so. I think that we're probably going to see this catch and kill. I mean, we won't even see it, actually, but I think the practice is going to continue of particularly tabloids buying up the stories of the rich and powerful and then killing them off. and wielding the concordant influence that they can have over the person.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the thing, isn't it? It's not just that he's a mate of Trump's, the guy that owns the National Enquirer. It's that by having this story, he's got something to threaten him with.
Exactly. And we don't know what other stories may be out there.
Okay, next this week, it's Felicity. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
A highly controversial Chinese New Year.
您好，这位是？这是我们培训中心的老师。阿姨好。太热情了。老师送给你水果。谢谢阿姨。老师啊，卡瑞在家里天天夸奖你，说你帅呆了。过奖。哦，今天一见，果然很呆。
That was the Chinese New Year Gala broadcast recently on CCTV. Now, Felicity, that's literally what that was, but I'm none the wiser. Enlighten us, what were we just listening to?
This was the annual Spring Festival Gala, which is broadcast on Chinese state television. It's one of the most, if not the most watched television program in the world. It attracts something like 700 million viewers.
Wow, so that's like 6 Super Bowls.
Yeah, this is big viewing figures. And this year was particularly controversial as there was a segment of the show, a skit, that was designed to show off and celebrate cozy, happy relations between China and Africa, including a sort of performance, if you like, of a Chinese-built high-speed rail line in Kenya. It's like a pantomime. It depicted a high-speed rail being built in Kenya. What could possibly go wrong, you might say? Well, everything went wrong in that it was highly racist and highly insensitive.
How?
How? Well, the actors had decided to use blackface. So there was a Chinese actress who had donned herself in blackface. She had prosthetic buttock implants. She was wearing a bowl of fruit on her head, and her sidekick...
This doesn't get any better. Yeah.
Her sidekick was an African actor, but he had been forced to dress up... Well, sorry, not forced, but he was dressed up as a monkey. Yes, just all the racial stereotypes and horror that you can imagine.
Okay. What? There's been reaction to this, presumably internationally, people saying this is racist. Do Chinese people think this is racist?
So yes, so the story this week was that there has been an international outcry over it, and the Chinese government has actually responded with quite a kind of robust, bellicose response instead of sort of apologising profusely as you would expect people to do. They've sort of said that it wasn't racist at all, and actually this is the West trying to make it seem as though China's being racist when they're not.
I mean, the BBC used to broadcast the black and white minstrel show in my lifetime. That's public service broadcasting in Britain. It wasn't considered racist in the 70s. It might have been by the 1980s. Is this just a case of actually Chinese kind of cultural understanding is 30, 40 years behind where we are in Britain, and it's not necessarily our business beyond pointing out that it's racist to demand government responses on that? If it wasn't intended to be racist.
I don't think that's the point, though, and I feel that's a bit of a cop-out to say, well, we didn't intend it to be racist. I mean, the point is that China wants to be seen as a global player on the international stage. And, I mean, this isn't the first time that they have had... It's deeply ingrained, the racism, in some of the adverts and some of the statements that we see. And I think for China's sake, I don't think they can keep on coming out with this kind of stuff if they're prepared to be taken seriously as a global player.
I mean, it's interesting, Rebecca, isn't it? You know, Felicity made reference to adverts that we see from China. We only see those because of the internet. We never would have seen them before unless they'd made their way onto Tarrant on TV or whatever. So it's only because they're being spread virally. And maybe that's only happening arguably because American-funded companies, you know, Huffington Post, Yahoo, whoever, are posting these clips up.
The thing is, it comes down to a difference of culture and history. The problem being now that kind of Anglo-American influence is now kind of spread throughout the globe. So Anglo-American standards of what's offensive are kind of imposed haphazardly on other cultures because, you know, the offensiveness of blackface isn't about, you know, painting your face black in and of itself. It's about the hurtful legacy of minstrel shows, slavery, racist caricature, segregation, prejudice, discrimination, etc., etc.
Which the Chinese had no part in.
Which doesn't really have any cultural influence in China. The thing is that the Chinese government's response was not just that the West was trying to make it seem as though China was, you know, racist against Africans, but that was a deliberate attempt to undermine Chinese-African relationships because obviously China now is a huge investor in Africa and in lots of places, you know, far surpassing Western countries.
But the problem with that is that it wasn't just the West that was critical of this sketch, and actually various African countries came out and said, actually, we also disagree with this depiction of us, not only
Although that
because...
wasn't just the blackface, was it? It was also the fact that they depicted Africa in a sort of quasi-Lion King cliche. They were dancing to Waka Waka by Shakira when it started. So actually it wasn't actually necessarily just the Chinese actress who was in blackface. They were saying, don't portray Africa, which is a continent, as this weird kind of promotional video.
Yeah, exactly. And even though they were trying to highlight the important economic relations between China and Africa as a continent, the way that they came at it was in this sort of quasi-paternalistic, isn't it great that, we've helped you with this high-speed train, and in exchange we've got a whole lot of your resources,
Yeah, this is the thing. China has been accused of practicing neocolonialism. The skit kind of gave this impression of Africa's like this lovely, colourful country, and they give us their dancing and we give them our high-speed rail. It did definitely have that overtone to it, and of course the thing about the skit was that it ended with the Chinese actress in blackface saying, "I love China, I love Chinese people," and then cut to the audience who were all applauding rapturously. As well as the obvious offensive overtones, there's the deeper message of China is transforming innocent, empty Africa into this technological paradise, and the African people are so grateful for everything we've done, which obviously covers over a lot of the tensions that actually are present with such heavy Chinese involvement in Africa.
I mean, Felicity, aren't we just seeing the growing pains of a nation looking outward? And
Yeah.
actually, its internationalism is probably good for us.
I think, what's been said about the fact that, China doesn't have a complex history of colonialism in Africa, so it's never had to challenge its preconceptions in the way we're seeing now. But I think that's true, but I think that as China increasingly wants to do trade and wants to be communicating, it's going to have to start changing these attitudes. And I think I can't help but thinking China's massive issues with censorship have something to do with this, because the criticism of this gala was censored. So ordinary people in China, a lot of them won't actually realise that there has been an international outcry. So they can't have this discussion about, whether blackface is appropriate. And you also have to remember that China is a highly homogenous society. I think it's something like foreigners account for just 600,000 out of a population of roughly 1.4 billion people. So that conversation, it's just not happening.
But how can you make it? How can you make that conversation relevant to the ordinary Chinese person who, in more rural areas could easily go their entire lifetime without seeing a foreign person or a black person? At the government level, they probably are going to have to start trying to, tamp down that kind of overt racism on the world stage. But I wonder how long it's going to take for that message to permeate through China when it's going to seem very relevant.
If at all. But I think censorship is one of the major obstacles to that.
And also the fact that China does have 56 different ethnic groups, but over 90% of people in the country are Han Chinese. So it's not even that racially diverse, and maybe that's kind of what is underpinning some of the unchallenged racist attitudes that go on television. Maybe in that sense we could almost forgive something about it.
I guess also the other thing is that we can't forget, it's not like we're in the West, we're just totally not racist anymore. I mean, Trump called Africa a shithole, didn't he? And we had that Dove advert recently. Didn't Dove get in trouble for making it seem as though a black woman will turn white if you use a Dove product, which is very similar to a very offensive Chinese product where a woman puts a black man in the wash and he comes out as a white Chinese man. So we're not exactly like...
that one was a bit overblown though, because it was a model turning into different people of different ethnicities, and it just happened to be a black person turning into a white person in 1 minute, and then the woman involved in the advert came forward afterwards and said that she wasn't offended by it. But it does show that we are possibly, hyper aware, possibly sometimes too hyper aware, of the potential for offensiveness, which is something. I think,
I'd rather be that.
Yeah, rather
than
be that than
But it's worth acknowledging, isn't it, just how recent it's been. Like I said, the black and white minstrel show was in the 80s. Matt Lucas was playing Ting Tong on Little Britain 10 years ago.
And
on
he's
BBC
now said
One.
he regrets that and would do it again.
Well, and
didn't
he was also blacking out because they had that skit where he was the lazy black woman who ran the airport shop in that program. Was it Come Fly With Me? They did afterwards, and they were.
But again, the argument for that was Matt Lucas and David Walliams play every character in this show, so that includes the black character.
That's just the old caveat thing of I'm an equal opportunities racist, or.
But it is a defence, isn't it? It's the same as Eddie Murphy playing white characters in Coming to America.
Well, it's just a bit. You have to strip away so much context, and if you stripped away all the context from blackface, then blackface wouldn't be offensive at all. You know, it's just all based on context, which in China isn't present, and in lots of the world as well. So I think it's probably going to be a slow process.
Very slow.
And finally this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
All the terrorist atrocities are a stage, and all the men and women merely players.
The Democrats have been caught in false flags before. I'm not saying this is a false flag, but they've been talking about massacres and things if people don't leave them alone and release the memos. So if there are massacres and they keep threatening massacres, that makes them suspects when they've been threatening massacres, and who knows what mentally ill person they've wound up or what's happening, or is this gang related? We don't know. The media will say that I said it's a false flag and the Democrats did it. I did not say that. We're simply questioning the long history that these folks have.
Professional contrarian Alex Jones there, speaking on his InfoWars show back in February. Rebecca, Jones uses this term false flags rather knowingly. What is it?
So false flags, a conspiracy theory, like kind of a branch of conspiracy theories, which hold that terrorist attacks, mass shootings, these kinds of mass casualty events are staged, usually by the government, is the usual explanation, to advance some kind of nefarious purpose. A very common train of thought is that mass shootings are staged in order for the government to have an excuse to impose tougher gun laws, eventually stripping Americans of their firearms, which opens the door to government tyranny and possibly rule by a new world order, etc., etc.
Okay, and he was saying this about the shooting in the high school in Florida, and how soon after it was happening was he saying this?
It must have been, I think it was the week after.
Okay.
It was last week that he was talking about this. And so they hold that, when you see, so of course you might say, but what about all the footage of people running away from the school? What about all the injured people? The explanation for that is that they are all crisis actors who have been paid and trained to take the role of, survivors or witnesses. And so the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, which was the Florida school that had the mass shooting last month, one of the students, his name's David Hogg, has become kind of an obsession of these conspiracy theorists who've latched onto him and accused him of being a crisis actor. Doctored pictures of him supposedly in other high schools' yearbooks have been circulated, and footage of him in California, speaking as an eyewitness on a local news program, have been spread around as evidence that he was in California before, and he's obviously been transported out to Florida to play the part of this shooting survivor in Florida. So he has gone back to school under that shadow of being, turned into this obsession for online conspiracy theorists.
I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? It's beyond bizarre, really. It's a social media thing, isn't it? People see him on CNN or even on Fox News talking powerfully about the experience that affected him and his fellow students. He's a good, compelling talker, isn't he? He's quite charismatic and good-looking. He talks in sound bites. He obviously had kind of thought carefully about the message he wanted to bring across. I followed him on social media when I saw him. Hundreds of thousands of people did. And then other people obviously had the reaction, well, that means he's an actor.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't the first time that we've seen it happen. I think, obviously, 9/11 truthers have been banging this drum about 9/11 for, ever since it happened. One of the things that's interesting to me about this week specifically, this instance with the Parkland, Florida shooting, is how it's false flag accusations have become one of the kind of beats that we now hit in all of these mass shooting events. It started, Sandy Hook was a really high-profile example of this because there was a lot of outrage over the fact that these grieving parents, some of them had been targeted by trolls online who were bombarding them with emails or tweets accusing them of not really having a child.
I didn't hear about the Sandy Hook false flag until I started reading about this one. So I think in that way, obviously it was happening at the time, but it certainly hadn't reached a lot of people. And I think that's really important because that you just can't give the oxygen of publicity to these false flags because they're just so offensive and ridiculous.
Well, isn't that what we're doing though? So, Rebecca, why have you done this?
Well, this is another thing from this week, is that there was an article in Wired that suggested that the reason that the most recent batch of false flag allegations have become so mainstream was the fact that they were being generated by outrage online. So it's trending because people are all saying, gosh, I really disagree with this, how disgusting that people are saying that. And now, of course, it's just at the forefront of everyone's mind, even though it's obviously a small minority.
Did you see that article as well, Arion?
I did, yeah.
So liberals amplify far-right messages by saying it's rubbish.
Yeah, the article said there's a kind of several-step process that starts with the fringe elements making it up. It then gets picked up by the sort of bot army of Twitter and Facebook, which then amplifies it, and it reaches liberals who, in their outrage, further spread it, therefore their party to or complicit in the propagation of these weird views.
So who are the kind of people that tweet saying this is obviously nonsense and then end up amplifying it by mistake?
Well, there's people like Chelsea Clinton. She had tweeted something.
Two name drops for Chelsea Clinton in today's show. Who knew?
Well, she had tweeted to one of these trolls, like instead of directing all your anger to these kids, like, can you turn it back to me again? Because obviously she's so high profile, she actually spread it a little bit further even more, and so more people were aware of it.
And I think it was Donald Trump Jr. on the flip side liked a tweet that linked to a story that suggested that this student was a crisis actor, possibly not having fully read it, but again bringing it to that wide audience of people. And it's not the first time that people connected to the Trump administration have backed those kind of wacky conspiracy theories.
Okay, but how much is this sort of ordinary users or even celebrity users of social media's fault? And how much is it actually due to the slightly odd algorithms that govern the way we all encounter stories now? So, you're talking about Donald Trump Jr. liked a tweet. It's only because of the slightly clumsy mechanism of Twitter where the only option to kind of, save a tweet for later to remember to look at is by literally pressing like.
Yeah, and of course,
that comes about. He might not have literally liked it. He might have thought, that's an interesting theory that we should discuss with Dad. And, it is.
There's just not really much scope for nuanced interpretation
Exactly.
in a world where hundreds of thousands of pairs of eyes are looking at Donald Trump Jr.'s Twitter account to glean some kind of insight into, him or his father's administration.
And it's the algorithms picking up the Twitter bots that is then promoting the story, isn't it? Saying, hundreds of thousands of people have put this forward,
but
therefore we'll bring it to you.
Then it's not the Twitter accounts are writing articles in The Guardian and CNN about how disgusting this is and why did it happen, and here's more information about false flags. But of course, it's exactly the same, as coverage of mass shootings. Yes, there is an argument that the more you cover them, the more you encourage other people to either to copy those attacks or in this case to become drawn into this conspiracy theory world. But, obviously there's the censorship argument of, if this is what people want to hear about, then people have a right to write about it.
Presumably it works both ways in that the more people are hearing about these false flags, the more people are going to say, well, that's completely ridiculous and debunk them. It's not necessarily that the more people hear about it saying like, ooh, they were crisis actors after all. Surely most...
I think that conspiracy theories are compelling in their own right, and you can almost understand why they are popular and why they'll never not be popular, even if these, you would have to accept, are particularly weird ones. But David Aronovich, who is an author who wrote this book called Voodoo History, which is all about how conspiracy theories shaped the modern world, according to him, says that conspiracy theories help to fill the void. They sort of fill that information gap that almost necessarily, and perhaps these school shootings haven't had so much of an information gap, particularly the most recent one, because they caught the guy who did it. But something like 9/11, where there was a lot of information that was unknown for a long time, you could almost understand why conspiracy theories arose to fill those gaps.
It's getting more insidious. I feel things have changed recently in that it seems like a way more febrile atmosphere, that in terms of fake news and echo chambers, it feels like there's way more false stuff going around and sort of more stupid people who will just believe.
Well, because this is the thing. If false flags become mainstream and everyone knows about them, yes, maybe 99% of people will say that's ridiculous. But if 1% becomes interested and it's being exposed to a large audience, that's potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are now quite interested in this idea that maybe they were crisis actors. The thing with false flags is, yes, they do sound outrageous to us, but actually false flags are a real thing. Yeah. That has happened. Putin has been accused of, during his time in the KGB, orchestrating a bombing attack that was then blamed on Chechen terrorists. And it happened recently.
But
with
why
Russia's...
don't people care about facts anymore?
But the thing is
why can't...
false flags aren't... It seems obvious to us that that shooting wasn't...
Shooting. Yeah.
But people would dismiss false flags as being crazy, but in and of themselves, they are a thing that happens. And they're a thing that, at the time, people who pointed out, the inconsistency, say, in Putin's account of the bombing, were dismissed as crazy and were suppressed. And, we saw it with Russia. Supposedly now we're hearing that they tried to launch a cyber attack during the Winter Olympics and make it look like it was North Korea. Now, that was a classic false flag that actually did work. It's been exposed now, but at the time...
And if there is a change that's happened this week, maybe, I'll posit, you can agree or disagree, it's that verified users on Twitter, for example, might think twice before combating a story that they think is untrue because they realise they might be giving it the oxygen of publicity. And it's also that perhaps the tech companies might say, you know what, you cannot troll the victims. of a mass shooting.
I think that's very optimistic. I'd say if
Well,
anything,
YouTube have taken some of the videos down,
I
haven't
know,
they?
but if anything, I'd say it's gone too far. I feel like this is the week that we now expect the conspiracy theory backlash every time there's a terrorist event now, and it's become part of the rich palette of things that happen every single time an atrocity like this takes place. And I don't really know how we can roll it back.
Well, that is the end of this edition of The Week Unwrapped. There's no conspiracy there. My thanks to Arion McNicoll, Felicity Capon and Rebecca Gillie. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter The Weekday, or go one better, get the magazine delivered to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And if you enjoy this show, and if you got this far, you probably do, go find us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. It helps us find more wonderful, attractive, articulate listeners like yourselves. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.